Welcome to 775 Alive, where we're going to be looking at world, national, state, and local issues from the perspective of rural Nevada, that area in the 775 area code outside of Las Vegas. I'm Scott Gavorski.
And I'm Crystal Newton.
And we wanted to take a little bit of a dive here into what's probably one of the most pressing news stories right now for the last couple of weeks, which has been the relationship with Iran and particularly President Trump's decision here to bomb the Iranian nuclear facilities, which immediately led to the ceasefire and end of the 12-day war.
Scott wants to take a deep dive, and I just want to take a victory lap. It's been a long time coming. I've been kind of. It's been frustrating for me to see all the sanctions over decades and decades, and then just watch them. They do business with China and Russia. That's where they get their income. It doesn't really hurt them. It's like a cat and mouse game. Like finally, someone did something decisive. And they did it with the B-2 bomber and the bunker buster bombs.
Yeah. Right.
And actually, I think one of the people that ran for Senate was it last year?
Yeah, in 2024. You're thinking Tony Grady, right?
Yeah. He was a B-2 bomber pilot or trainer?
Well, he was a test pilot when the B-2 Spirit bomber. He was an Air Force Academy graduate and was a test pilot for a number of years, particularly in bomber aircraft, and was part of the team that did the test up and working of the B-2 when it came online in the late 80s, early 90s.
Well, and they haven't released the names of the people who bombed Iran. It might have been him.
Well,
he'd win office next time if that was his platform. Like I'm the one that dropped the bomb.
Tony's happily retired. He was actually up here for our Lincoln Day dinner.
He was.
Yeah, him and I graphing out Marxist theory on the back of placards.
Yeah, super easy to talk to.
Oh yeah, great guy.
I think Nevada leaders in general are super easy to talk to.
Oh yeah.
I mean, they look a little intimidating, but you talk to them, they're just happy to say hi and chat about the weather.
Yeah. And maybe I know you have some flight questions for him next time you meet, being a pilot and all.
Well, I like it. I wonder if you're flying a plane, you drop 30,000 pounds out the back. Do you go up really fast or forward really fast? I'm like, I want to ask him. Right. I really want to know.
It's an interesting question. And that whole operation was fascinating for a number of reasons out beyond the political. I mean, logistically, I think it's going to be very much like the Vulcan raids during the Falkland Islands War back in '82, where bombers leave England and fly to the other side of the globe to hit Argentine military installations and multiple in-air refuelings and everything. It's fascinating stuff, particularly for military historians or people that lean in that direction like me.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of controversy over whether or not Trump. I guess the Democratic side is insisting that he should have declared war before making these strikes and. I remember going, okay, well, what is the actual legal language that governs that? And I just, you're much better at sussing out those lines than I am. But I mean, as far as I could tell, if it's a limited strike and it's not a prolonged engagement, then the president as commander in chief can make limited actions without.
Yeah. And I'm not sure I'm going to give you a definite answer to this because I'm not sure there is one. The current controversy stems from the 1973 War Powers Resolution, which Congress did authorize the president that in cases where an immediate decision was required, there doesn't have to be a declaration of war, as the Constitution specifies. Now, that being said, the War Powers Resolution, which of course comes out of Vietnam and Korea and some of the disputes about that, it actually touches on a much deeper thing. We've as a country been arguing this since about 1786. Yeah. The quasi war, or 1796, excuse me, decade too early. The quasi war with France, which was one of the first wars we get into, and the whole reason we have a separate department of the Navy, by the way. That was an undeclared war, where Congress gave Adams the authority to stop French raids on American shipping, and it sort of blossomed into this sort of ongoing effort between France and the United States to raid each other's shipping across the Caribbean.
Well, it's a fine line, right? Because what country wants to telegraph that they're going to go to war? I mean, if you have to go to Congress and declare it, then your enemy has this advantage. And how much we want to officially stamp war every time.
Well, and we are dealing in a world where that communication stream is a little bit different than the 18th century, shall we say.
Yeah.
But still, a lot of the controversy boils down it actually, I think, boils down to a question: what constitutes a war? And one of the things the War Powers Resolution does, and it's very controversial, even when everybody in Congress is with how it's used, right? So, for instance, some of the language that's used in the War Powers in the reports, it's So the War Powers Resolution requires the president, once the action is initiated, to report back to Congress, and it
Right.
can't go on more than 60 days. And there's some other stuff.
Yeah. Troops on the ground.
Troops on the ground.
Defining elements. Yeah.
But a lot of these, how those reports are phrased, look totally different from anything else that's reported to Congress, because they know they're sort of on shaky constitutional grounds.
Yeah.
Just nobody's sued yet. So there's some very weird stuff about the War Powers Resolution. That being said, of course, Ro Khanna.
There's the precedents that presidents set.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's one of the interesting things is that
Clinton was it Kosovo?
Well, no, Kosovo was authorized by Congress.
Was it?
Sudan was a big one.
Yeah.
Right. This is one of the raids that really gets bin Laden charged up against the U.S. Sudan. There are a couple other places that Clinton bombed. Of course, Obama bombed Syria. Right. George W. Bush. And remember, the Iraq War was passed by Congress, and as was the Afghanistan War. Right.
So do you feel like the liberal media coverage of this as being an unconstitutional act, do you feel like that's irresponsible, or that's just run-of-the-mill freedom of speech?
No, well, it's not freedom of speech. I think since the War Powers Resolution was passed in '73, the first news story that hits every time we get into a conflict is that the president's acting unconstitutionally. That's just a default decision. But what I was going to say is that, and it doesn't matter who the president is.
Because, Jasmine Crockett was very upset that Trump didn't ask her first.
Well, and Ro Khanna, Democrat senator from California, introduced a resolution in the Senate to stop it. But I think part of the problem is that the War Powers Resolution actually allows the president to take, has a broader range of actions if Congress authorizes sort of an ongoing set of hostilities.
Yeah.
So Obama is in trouble for bombing Syria, which is a state, but actions he took against supposed terrorists was covered because Congress basically said, okay, we'll give the president authority to react against terrorism as part of the war on terror. One of the arguments, and I can't find a document, which means either there might not be one or it's buried somewhere else. I'm pretty sure for 30 years, Congress have authorized presidents that if a threat emerges in Iran, they're allowed to take actions.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a huge, huge part of the dynamic here.
Well, there's the legal side, but one of the reasons why I asked the media question is because it is tied to the second controversy, which is the leak that happened with the preliminary report, which all news media and journalists understood to be a very vague document. There's no way to actually get boots on the ground and check it out, but the fact that they ran with it and it was a leaked piece of information, it's all tied together, these behaviors by media that I'm starting to find to be, you know how I am. I like more strict lines, but I'm like, at what point is it freedom of speech in which it's completely deliberately misleading?
Right. Well, let's break that down a little bit, because I think there's an interesting dimension. So after the strikes happened, they kept everybody off guard. Trump, again, in response to the taco comment, said it's going to be 2 weeks before he makes a decision, and 8 days later the strike occurs. Right.
That's the lamest name calling I've seen in a long time. Chuck E. Cheese. I'm giving him a new nickname.
But that being said, so what happens? A couple days, there's a leak out of the Pentagon. It looks like it came out of Defense Secretary Higgs's office.
Well, I'm pretty sure that Trump's going to find him.
Well, no, they've escorted somebody out.
Okay.
But what was leaked, what's more interesting than the leak occurring, which is bad enough on its own and something we've been having a problem with, is that what was leaked was a very low confidence, initial, very vague assessment.
Yeah.
And anybody who read it says, well, we did, this is not much better than speculation. Right. But it seemed to indicate the raid failed. And then the news media ran with it. And I think the pushback was a response to Trump's experience here during his first administration, where so many of these leaks get published and we have an explosion of policy pushbacks that's detrimental to what Trump wants to do, before anybody realizes that what was leaked was either inaccurate, not correct, or incomplete. And I think they're really trying to close that down. I think the reaction that President Trump had towards the media, what media is characterized as anger, and perhaps justifiably so, is like, look, everybody who knows anything knows that this is something that's going to take a couple of days to figure out what went on. But you're running with it to change policy before we even know if it worked.
Yeah, and it's egregious within our borders, but when you kind of extend the overall strategy of trying to win this and bring peace and resolution to this conflict, you've seen Iran did. They bombed the base on Qatar as kind of a face-saving bombing. Right. And, when our media is reporting that our strike didn't do that much damage, it actually backs up Iran's propaganda that we are winning this war, and it emboldens the terrorist groups and the opposing forces. So part of the reason I'm getting so bent out of shape about what they did was not just that it was egregious within our own culture, but it actually bolstered the Iranian regime. It gave them that back. I mean, they literally will bomb a base. They called ahead, clear out all your people. I don't want this to be a real incident. But they went through the measure of actually bombing a base just to save face and prove to their people that they won. And then you have our media that's saying, yeah, they did win. I'm like, you're actually helping a terrorist organization.
So we've got two.
It's so controversial sounding, but I'm like, isn't that what that was?
Well, I would disagree because I think first of all you're confusing or conflating two sort of separate arguments. One actually goes back to the War Powers Resolution, and we've actually seen this quite a bit. This is realpolitik. In diplomatic circle, real politics. Bismarck's 19th century, German Chancellor Bismarck's 19th century formulation. And we've actually seen Trump engage in this before. You remember when he took out Soleimani back in, 2020, the Iranian general that was in charge of training these terrorist groups that were attacking American troops in Iraq. And he takes them out in Iraq. So there's no violation of Iranian space, but he is an Iranian officer. And if you remember, about 48 hours later, the Iranians struck back. And that was the end of it.
Yep.
So this sort of if you excuse the expression, tit for tat sort of a sort of arrangement is actually incredibly common in diplomatic affairs because it allows both sides to save face and draw back from having to do a war.
Right? I understand the tit for tat. I'm just saying, though, the whole reason you do a tit for tat is to save face. And if the liberal media is supporting that face-saving propaganda, that's supporting them.
Well, the problem is
because they're basically saying we won. We came out ahead, and it's like if the liberal media is saying, "Oh, nothing got accomplished," then they're like, "See."
Well, I mean, the problem is if you have freedom of the press and freedom of speech, you got to allow criticism.
I know.
That's. I mean,
so I say, I was like, how I am. I like these clean lines, and that freedom of speech covers everything.
Right. Well, but no, it's not so much that it covers everything. I think a more damaging question, and I know you want to get to this, and we probably will at the end, is how effective the strike actually was.
Yeah.
Which is all over the place. But I think part of the issue that's going on here is actually the media was trying to make this out as something that what Trump really wants is regime change in Iraq. And I don't think that is. They're throwing back echoes of George W. Bush, and the Iraq War and everything. And that was one of the first questions: is there a regime change? But this type of exchange of blows, and again, the Americans, I mean, the Iranians apparently called and gave them enough time to evacuate. They kept 40 guys at the base, let them destroy the base, and we'll call this even, right? And to be honest, Iran doesn't have another option.
Yeah,
I mean, that's one of the things I think it revealed. But more importantly, I think this is a media trying to attack President Trump along domestic lines and show that his policies are random. Well, he wanted regime change and he couldn't even do the most basic thing to guarantee regime change, which sort of presumes, that that was his goal all along.
Well, right? I totally agree that the media's aimed their attacks at him for those purposes, but I'm thinking they're not recognizing how much support that lends to Iranian propaganda. But no, I totally get what you're saying there. But I would actually, I know we've been back and forth on this, but there is something to be said about, let's say there's minimal damage done during the strikes. Make like the bare minimum got done and it barely pushed them back. I would actually, and this is really going to shock you because I've been arguing the other side the entire time. So here on live recording. So I started to think, I've been so frustrated about 40 years of us trying to take the diplomatic route. And, anyone with half a brain can see that we're getting played. And it just frustrated me. And I guess, to actually make a physical action does signal to the Iranians that we're changing course on how we're dealing with you. So that's changed for sure.
Right.
Regardless of whether those nuclear sites were badly damaged or just barely damaged. I'm like, we did something different with them. It's going to make them sit up and change course. So we'll see how that looks.
Right. Well,
but they're almost out of missiles, by the way.
Yeah.
They've got to be like 75% of their missiels. They've got nothing left. So
because of the ongoing conflict with Israel. And I think
be down to water balloons.
or scarier.
Throw them at our drones.
Scarier stuff. Yeah, I think it's worthwhile remembering that this American action wasn't in isolation. Right. There's already an ongoing conflict where Iran had started targeting some of the nuclear facilities. Iran couldn't get to everything, but Iran really did take out a lot of the early warning, the aircraft system or the air defense systems. Israel took out, by all accounts, a good bit of their scientific personnel.
Yeah.
Which is probably one of the most important aspects of the operation. But going back to this, one of the things on the propaganda is that propaganda isn't playing with anybody else except within the Iranian government propaganda. Nobody else is buying it. I mean, that's been one of the more interesting things that's emerged out of this, is that for as much as the American media have focused on this one, and I guess now there's a second report that's doubting how much damage has been done, our allied media, not just Israel, but, from what we heard from the Saudis, what we're hearing out of Europe, what we're hearing at the UN, they think this was incredibly an effective strike, right? So you have an interesting situation where there's actually quite a bit of question here about this effectiveness of the strike and where it fits into long-term policy vis-a-vis Iran.
Yeah, and you got to remember too, in an isolated population, the internal domestic propaganda is the only thing that matters. You see that in North Korea and in Russia. And Russia, I think I'm really particularly sensitive about Iran because I've watched Russia use liberal media snippets to show back to their people just what disarray and chaos America is in. And I've just watched that used against us to that regime's benefit. And it has started to frustrate me. And I see that with Iran. That's why I'm bringing it up, is because I'm recognizing they're using our own media to their advantage. And that's I wonder if the liberal media understands that.
Well, I think they do, but I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? Yeah. This is one of the problems with any type of authoritarian regime, is that nobody really knows. I mean, there's that famous quote. I think it was Václav Havel, who wrote in one of his works, that the whole thing with the Soviet regimes is they're lying. We know they're lying. They know we know that they're lying. They know that we know that we know that they're lying, and still they lie, right? So the question is, how effective is this in there? So I think it does help undermine among certain segments of the population trust in the American media, which is an ongoing issue.
Now, I am glad that you did start to bring up the global community and how they're responding to this. I think there's going to be a lot of the global community on the Western side that is a little hesitant to sort of do the rah-rah victory dance, but I think they're all enormously relieved.
Right.
And there is this huge question going around about imminent threat.
Right.
This is a very, very important little phrase. And so you have one side that's like, there wasn't an imminent threat because once you get the enriched uranium, then you have to build the warhead. So you're still, a ways out. So, so I strongly agree that it was an imminent threat.
Right.
And the reason why is because in order to use uranium for a nuclear facility, like a power plant, you only need to enrich it to 3.5%, 5%.
Right.
Iran's at 60%. The only reason you would go past 3.5 or 5%, the only purpose is for military purpose. And so the last trace test came back in like the 80 percentile, 70 percentile range. And so the global community, absolutely everyone, this was red flags. This was the end of our patience, because once you get to 90%, it's, we don't know.
Right.
So I felt like that fit the definition of imminent threat, because there is no reason to enrich it past that small percentage unless you're going to make a nuclear weapon. So, I mean, there's no other explanation, right?
Well, yeah, and that's been one of the problems. And of course, one of the controversies is that the U.S. under the 1950s era Atoms for Peace had actually encouraged Iran, which was an ally of the United States at the time, and a lot of other a lot of other countries around the world to begin developing nuclear power programs and provided with the technology. And, part of this was to destigmatize the fact that America could effectively use nuclear weapons. Part of it was part of a sort of 50s belief this was the future.
Yeah.
Right. So, that 3 to 5% is fine, but there is a growing concern why because 60% is not capable of sustaining weapon style fusion.
It's not.
Or fission, sorry.
It's a whole heck of a lot closer to 90 than 3.5.
Well, that's the problem. No, and that's the problem.
It's like the 5-year-old with chocolate on his face. Like, did you eat cake? And they're like, no.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay.
Well, there is that, but the more worrying thing is that going from that 5% to the 60% is about 90% of the effort you need to get to the 90% that is weaponizable.
Yeah.
So the fact they got the 60 means, it's not that they only have a 30% more to go. It's like, next week they can start producing weapons grade.
Yeah.
That was the concern, and that's what sparked this sort of quest here to deal with something. And now is that it's that close to making the uranium.
Yeah. So serious threat.
You're right.
That was the time to stop it, because once it's enriched, and I looked this up, it said it was 800 pounds of uranium, and I was like, how big is that? It's about the size of a gallon jug.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
uranium is very dense.
This can be put in easily maneuver, like it can be transported very easily, and you just don't want it to be at that point. That you cannot get to that point. That's the end of that story.
And can I give a shout out real quick?
Okay.
Yeah. So we're talking about all this enrichment, but I want to throw a shout out to Jordan of the Unbiased Politics podcast, who really did a deep dive into what all this enrichment stuff means.
Yeah.
On her stuff, it was really interesting. I was.
Well, you hated it. I actually loved it because to me that illustrated the imminent threat part of it. Because once I understood that there's no reason to enrich past 3.5%. I was like, they're definitely making a nuclear bomb.
Right.
There's no other way to interpret this.
And I point out, Jordan, don't come after me. I didn't hate it. I thought she went on a little too long about it, but it's still good. Right. If you really want to go into a deep dive about percent enrichment, unbiased politics. But that being said, I think, and of course, the other problem, and this gets us into the question of how effective it is what happens next? Because even uranium at 90% on its own isn't dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. It has to be milled to do the implosion, and that requires equipment. One of the reasons you see so often on these sanction lists stuff like computer-controlled milling machines is that's one of the ways you can, so there were probably some stages, and then there's the whole question of delivery, right? And going back to the international community, this is one of the key concerns, I think, is that effectively nobody thinks Iran has intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so, the fact that Iran was going to lob a missile next week into the United States wasn't going to happen. But Europe is within change of their existing missiles, which could very readily be adapted once they have the warhead.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, Israel as well.
Well, it is tough I really feel like this is it for now. Everything's going to settle back down, but we still don't have the uranium, and we don't quite know the status of what's going on there. So we have a lot to be seen. But I do certainly think the global community has breathed a sigh of relief for at least a few months.
Right.
But at the end of the day, though, Iran's almost out of missiles. They're almost out of their stock. Their GDP is twice that of Nevada's. What is 400 million a year, and they sell to China, Iraq, Russia, primarily. And they're in a bad position, right? So these countries are probably really bending them over the barrel on price. Like, well, you've got sanctions all over the place. No one's going to buy your stuff, so we're going to buy it for 50 cents on the dollar. So my point is, they don't have the economy to keep fighting. They don't have the missile stocks to keep fighting. They kind of shot their load.
Right.
So I don't know what else, unless they start bringing in allies. That's about the only way they move forward.
Well, I don't think they are. Let's if we could.
And Russia's depleted too, by the way. So where are they going to go?
And it was interesting, Putin's comments just a couple of days ago, saying all of a sudden that he's back to being buddy-buddy with Trump.
We've almost forgot about Russia and Ukraine. And they've had some of the most intense battles in the last couple of weeks of the entire war, but we haven't really heard about it. So it kind of makes me feel like there's some kind of something between Iran and Russia. They seem to be coordinating a bit.
Yeah, and let's if you don't mind, I'd like to take that as two separate questions. One, status of Iran's weapons program. Maybe we can go back to your gallon of uranium comment, because I think that's a useful place to start. But then I think we need to talk about, I think one of the major repercussions of this strike is it's shifted some global discussions. So maybe if we end up with that. So one of the concerns, and remember, for those of us who haven't watched a lot of our podcasts, these grow out of discussions we're usually having when we're, wandering around rural Nevada or working on projects or something, right? So we're finding really interesting stuff to talk about. But one of the things you've been concerned about, if I remember right, was that, the 800 pounds of uranium is about the size of a gallon because it's so dense, right?
Yep.
And the rumor that there were, when the first Israeli strikes happened, there's a line of trucks coming out of these facilities, and it might have the uranium, it might have the equipment, the centrifuges and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was my big concern, was as soon as Israel started bombing, they started loading something out of those facilities.
And you're hearing a lot about...
and I'm sure we tracked them.
You're right.
Well, watch where those trucks went.
Right. And who knows if we got any, but that's one of the big media points. The thing that strikes me about that is sort of twofold. So one, more basically, right? So great. They get all the centrifuges out. They get all the machinery, get the uranium out. It's not like those trucks drove to a newly rented warehouse space in Tehran and just unloaded and set up operation.
Yeah.
I would imagine a facility is probably a little bit more sophisticated to that. So even if they got the equipment, it's probably going to take them a few months to get everything set back up, if they can. Because here's the other thing I think is key to that, is the fact that Iran's nuclear program started back, weapons program, started back almost 30 years ago. Clinton was dealing with this back in the 90s, right? It's a 30-year-old program with 30 years of investment. They now have to start from scratch for most of that investment.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure they have the resources to recreate what they've already had.
No.
Right.
And I do wonder, too, where Iran's motivation is to get a nuclear weapon. Because even if they do have them, they surely see the rest of the big global powers. It's once you get one, it's a standstill. Well, there's no way to leverage a nuclear weapon once you have one.
No.
Like, they can get all sorts of benefits and handouts and money up until they make one. So I'm like, it makes more sense that they would just continuously be in the, we're threatening to make one. No,
I utterly disagree with that. What having a nuclear weapon buys? So first of all, nobody's worried about small nuclear powers triggering a nuclear holocaust, right? With all due respect to Annie Jacobson's already spoke on nuclear war. North Korea doesn't want it just a lot at the U.S. and destroy all life on Earth. What it does is having a nuclear weapon ups the ante for particularly the United States to move against your regime or what you're trying to do.
Okay.
So right now, if Iran decided, for instance, that it was just going to claim control over Iraq the same way the Soviet Union moved into Poland or Czechoslovakia or Eastern Europe after World War II, the U.S. would respond almost immediately with conventional military force. If Iran has a nuclear weapon, the U.S. response is going to be much more muted because of the fear that they'll push Iran into a point of using that even tactically against like U.S. troop concentrations. That's what it buys you. Is it sort of ups the ante for the U.S. getting involved against you, even if the weapon isn't worked.
That's a very interesting take. And I'm just, I've been puzzled about why NATO hasn't allowed Ukraine into NATO. If they were sincere about trying to protect that democratic country, they would have made them a member. And I've always, every time it came up to vote, Russia would make a whole bunch of moves to where the vote was never quite there.
Right.
And I'm now wondering, now that you're telling me this, is that part of the negotiating power of having a nuclear power?
Oh, yeah, very much so.
I mean, people were afraid if they allowed Ukraine in, Russia would go crazy.
Right. Now, again, the United States and Russia and probably China probably have enough weapons between them where it really is mutually assured discussion.
Destruction.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's definitely going to ensure some discussion.
Right. But destruction, yes. But that, this is, and we're getting a little far afield, but I think it's worthwhile. This is why India and Pakistan having nuclear weapons concerns a lot of people, like when the war broke out there a couple months ago.
Well, there's a lot of people upset that we just bombed a sovereign country, and it's important to point these things out. If they get a nuclear weapon, they can be bullies like Russia did with Ukraine, and look at Ukraine now. Ukraine's gone.
Well, but a far more damaging thing on the The far more damaging thing, I think, in the sovereign country issue that's important to point out is it's not just the United States, it's not just Israel, it's not just Europe that's worried about Iran.
Yeah.
Iran is unique in the Middle East. It's not an Arabic country.
That's right.
Right. Persian, the dominant language, is not a Semitic language. It's much closer to German English and whatnot. The Persian culture is distinctly different from the rest of Arabic culture in the Middle East. Their form of Islam is distinctly different, being the Shiite branch, and they're a center of Shiitism.
And I think it is important to bring up because that's part of why they're so antagonistic right now is they kind of see the Arab nations, which were traditionally somewhat allies, are kind of making more allyship towards the Western civilization, which has increased Iran's rhetoric and their petulance and their verbose overacting on the world stage. I think that's part of it. Is they're watching their Arab coalition kind of side with Western civilization.
And there was a lot of concerns during the Syrian civil war here over the last few years that Iranian-backed groups associated with Hamas and Hezbollah were active in that war. In part because one of the things that a lot of people didn't get was that the Shiite, the Shiite dynasty that are kings that had ruled Syria were Shiite. They weren't Sunni. So you had a Shiite monarchy ruling over a Sunni population for decades. And that's one of the tensions that was happening in that war. Right? But I think
like MAGA being ruled over by Kamala Harris.
Well, I'm not. No, I don't think that's the case at all. But I do think that there is, and again, my take on this is that it's really talking about real politics, realpolitik, where you have Saudi Arabia and a lot of these countries that want to play a bigger role in the global affairs are as threatened by Iran, even though it's a fellow Muslim country, as they feel threatened by the U.S. and Israel, who have developed increasingly strong relationships with over the last 25, 30 years. So it's an interesting dimension.
What do you think? We've completely left Israel out of this discussion. How does Israel see Iran? Is it done for Israel?
Yes and no.
That's kind of the more pivotal question, right?
Well,
we're the big guys. We're like, okay, whatever. But Israel's like right there.
And remember, this isn't the first time this has been done.
No.
Right? Israel attacked Iraq's nuclear weapons facility back in '81.
Yeah.
Right. The Bekaa Valley raid. Is that the right? Anyway.
They attacked the threat.
Yeah, they attacked the threat and took it out. Israel's problem right now is Israel, I think, at least under Netanyahu, has decided enough is enough, and they just need to end whatever's going on.
Yeah.
Right. I think that explains some of their actions against Hezbollah. I think it explains some of their actions against Hamas. I think it explains some of their actions against, like after the ceasefire was declared. Iran and Israel both violated it. Sparked Trump's, dropping the F-bomb outside of Marine One on the White House lawn, right? Just like, these two idiots need to stop, basically.
I was less shocked by the F-bomb than I was by the UN general guy calling Trump daddy.
Wow.
Even as a Trump fan, I was like, ew.
That might be, but it is a distinctly different approach. One thing I think Israel did is I think
he had the right phrase. It's a turn of phrase. Oh, daddy's home. But I mean, it just came out weird. Like Trump's daddy. I'm like, oh boy.
But that being said, I think Israel did play one very important role in this because we've talked about the infrastructure and the tools and the buildings and everything else. One thing we didn't talk about is that Israel appears to have taken out the majority of Iranian nuclear scientists.
Yeah.
And that's a huge question, whether that knowledge base still exists, if they were able to train other people that Israel might have missed. So even if they have all the equipment, it might take them a number of years to get enough people back together.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe.
And that's a lot of the unknowns.
Yeah.
Right at this moment. But from all accounts, and I think the fact that Iran went into this ceasefire so quickly indicates to me they realized they lost.
Yeah, they had nothing left.
They had nothing left.
Yeah.
And I think they needed to extract themselves.
So I think on its face, between Israel and Iran, it's kind of settled for now, but there is one huge outstanding issue, and that's what to do with Palestine.
Right.
I was listening to the Global News podcast this morning, and the whole excerpt they did was on how they're having to what was the phrase? They're taking food from hungry people to give to starving people. That's how they describe the situation. And I haven't been watching or following Palestine all that much, but if you have a situation where people are starving to death, that could really stir up and kick up new things, I think.
Well, there's a couple, yeah, and I think the Palestinian issue directly, in and of itself, is somewhat separate, other than the fact that Hezbollah and Hamas very much are supported by Iran. That's where the hungry versus starving comment. So you have an Iranian population that now for more than a generation has been under these extreme sanctions. And they're watching their resources being given to fight for Palestinian interference on behalf of a regime that's increasingly unpopular.
Yeah.
And that, going back to my comment about, now Iran has to rebuild nuclear facilities.
I have a choice between the two. Do we rebuild our nuclear facility, or do we keep trying to support Palestine? That's why I say it might be more of a teetering issue than you're giving it credit for.
Or
because nobody's going to just forget.
You're forgetting the third leg of that triangle, though. So it's build nuclear weapons, or continue to support Palestine, or address the complaints of our population. And that's the first. Either of the other two options are going to leave the population out, and that's where I don't think there's a possibility of regime change right now.
Yeah.
And I don't think that, because I really don't think the Iranian people have a clear enough organization and a clear enough plan of action to topple the government.
Yeah.
I do think the Iranian government's much more cognizant of the opinion of their population since the Arab Summer and the Green Revolution, some stuff that we've seen over the last 15 years. And that's going to have to factor into their policy, particularly if, and we'll know more after the negotiations with the International Atomic Energy Association or whatever restart. Because if Iran backs down and allows the inspectors in, I think the regime has made a clear choice. They're gonna have to bolster domestic support first.
Yeah. Well, and they're gonna have to settle down for a while. They don't have the ammunition. They don't have the economy. They don't have what it takes to keep going. But it is disheartening to me that this pretty much just looks like it's settled for a while.
Well,
and I'm like, gosh dang it! Like, are we ever going to get any resolution here?
Right.
And by the way, it's very, very bizarre to me that Iran would just shout publicly that they want to wipe Israel off the map. Like, you understand you're in a global community where no one accepts that kind of language.
Well, except they've accepted it since 1980.
Well,
right.
That's just it. It's like I feel like I'm like explaining something to a kindergartner. Right. It's not okay to use that language, Iran. If you're going to insist that you're going to wipe us off the map, we're going to have to stop you.
Right. But the problem is Iran's never paid the consequence, and indeed most of the countries that have used this genocidal language since World War II, very few of them have paid the consequences.
Which is why I consider it a victory that we hit them, and finally there's a consequence.
Right, but will it transfer into to accepting Israel? Who knows? I'm not sure.
Probably not.
I just want to point out Serbia is one of the few. Serbia, maybe Rwanda, maybe Sudan are about the only three that certainly charges of genocide didn't stick against Pol Pot in Cambodia. Okay. So I think however much we might feel about the language and however much the UN rails against it, they don't seem to want to do anything.
It's just such a bold, wild play.
But there is another consequence that not a lot of people are talking about. Because one of the things is that Iranian air defense system was a state-of-the-art system that was acquired from Russia and China.
Oh.
And they, not only has Israel taken it out, but what remained apparently didn't even ping on the bombers, the B-2 bombers. And
so we proved Russia and China's military techniques sucks.
And remember, that's the system that they're seeking to export to other countries.
I've heard that about China's battleships. That's like they're built like 300 of them, and we're like, whoa, it's a lot. And I'm like, well, they're not very good though.
Right. Well, quantity has a quality of its own.
They use the cheap steel.
But that being said, the fact that these state-of-art systems are supposed to stand up and keep American bombers and American aircraft from invading your airspace, and they failed so utterly in Iran, that's gonna be a consequence. I think it's going to take a few years to figure out, because not only does that, it strengthens the threat of American military power, which hopefully means if the threat's there, we don't have to actually use it because people will not poke the bear, so to speak. But at the same time, that could, if these orders dry up from China or for Chinese and Russian weapon systems, boy, that's going to have some repercussions on their economies.
Yeah.
And so
China is definitely way overproducing in their military side just so they can have the capacity for wartime. And they're completely overproducing. And if it's a crap technology, but the other side of me says, if I were Iran, I'd be wondering if they're treating me like the redheaded stepchild of this relationship and just giving them crap technology.
Well, and
what are they going to do?
Well, even if that's the case, and I think it's
I'd be
fair.
Offended.
I think it's fair to say Iran didn't have the cutting edge Chinese and Russian stuff.
Okay.
But even if that's the case, even if China and Russia were training them substandard systems, one of the things is that that's also going to impact other countries that China and Russia are contracting with to potentially supply, whether it be North Korea, whether it be Pakistan, whether it be numerous other countries. The truth is that if this failed so spectacularly, we might actually find not only Iran's sort of bravado busted, we might find Russia and China's bravado busted for a little while as well. So this could have some major global consequences beyond just the Iran or even the Iran-Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yes, the emperor has no clothes.
Right.
Well,
that's one more thing I think. Can I do on that? Because you see, that quote is so great. The emperor has no clothes. There's an interesting aspect to that. And that aspect is the fact that there's been a lot of people, and you're starting to see this emerge in some of the journalism, who've argued for years Iran's been a paper tiger.
Yeah.
Right. Somebody on the weekend kept using the term a Potemkin power. That's incorrect. I don't think the Potemkin village metaphor is quite accurate here.
But that's why I said it has twice the GDP of Nevada. It's not a big country with any kind of. Go ahead.
Well, no, it's no, you're absolutely right. But one of the interesting things that somebody was pointing out was that, if you go back to the Iranian-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, Iran, when that war starts, has 3 times the population of Iraq. By all accounts, Iran should have easily won that war. 8 years later, why they end up suing the peace is Iran is down to using basically child soldiers. They're like drafting 12, 13, 14-year-olds to go fight in Iraq. And then just a couple years after that war ends with Operation Desert Storm, the United States comes into an Iraqi army that had stood up for 8 years against Iran and takes them out in 100 hours.
Yeah.
So there is something where I think Iran's rhetoric has never matched its power capability. Nuclear weapons still would have changed that, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But I think in a weird way, this might have embarrassed Iran so deeply that they might be quintessent for a little while.
Well, they should have known. I mean, that kind of rhetoric, you can't back that up. I would feel really embarrassed to go out and make those strong statements and have nothing to back it up. You don't have the economy, don't have the allyship. I mean, anyways.
This is a common thing. And again, one of my long-term arguments is what we're seeing now is the collapse of a post-World War II international order. But you got to remember, nobody moved against North Korea when they got weapons. Nobody moved against Pakistan when they got nuclear weapons. So if you're Iran, there's very little evidence of anybody besides the Israelis doing anything if you have nuclear weapons. So we're really in uncharted territory about whether this deterrence. I mean, there's always been the threat if you develop nuclear weapons, the U.S. was going to come out and do something, but it's never happened.
I think Iran got a little bit of FAFO.
Yeah. That might be a good way of phrasing it.
I do, just really quick though, we have some great news. We can stop talking about these clowns on the global stage for a second. We had a great Supreme Court decision.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a series of them actually.
Birthright citizenship, it wasn't what was settled there, but you want to tell us about?
This was the case. Birthright citizenship was the topic. This was about whether the Trump administration could change the definition of birthright citizenship. That issue actually hasn't been decided yet.
Right.
But what it did was this was one of those lawsuits. We were talking a few episodes back about district judges, where a district judge orders a nationwide injunction. And the Supreme Court granted in a 6-3 decision, split down ideological lines. But the ruling was district judges cannot issue those national injunctions.
Yeah.
Right? We can't have a district judge saying, okay, well, I just unilaterally think the president's wrong and I'm going to stop his policies.
Yeah.
I would like, if you're okay with it, to come back and maybe do an episode on this in the future, because there were some not only interesting internal disputes on the court.
Yeah.
Right. The argument between Barrett and Ketanji Brown Jackson, I think, was very.
Oh, the drama.
Yeah. Well,
and you're right. It is like a whole episode with it, just how the different sides are and where we're at. You're absolutely right. I just wanted to bring the good news because I've been kind of horrified with the way district judges are setting policy and superseding the president. It's like, something's gone wrong here. And the Supreme Court put a stop to that. So we're still got to straighten everything out. But for
Mhm.
now, a district judge can't just go make a rule
Right.
for the whole. So
Well,
that's awesome.
right.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is we're expecting any day now a bunch of lawsuits based on
Yeah,
class action, national
Yeah.
class action suits are probably going to drop, which is okay because sooner or later, here's the irony: we've been so sort of bound up in the process. We probably really need to discuss the issues at the cases, but
Mhm.
we can't get to that point with these injunctions. So yeah, it's big news. It's certainly going to have some major repercussions over the next few weeks. But I think it's really something that probably requires a bit more of a deeper dive.
Some good wins there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yay for America.
yep.
Woohoo.
So again, if you have any questions, think we want to cover anything, go ahead and shoot us an email at info@775alive.com. Until then, I'm Scott Gaborski.
And I'm Crystal Newton.
We'll see you around the 775.